You know, when we think about India's fight for freedom, our minds usually jump to the big names, right? The famous national leaders, the Indian National Congress. But that's just one piece of a much, much larger puzzle. See, beneath that headline story, there were millions of people fighting their own desperate battles, not just for independence, but for basic dignity, for their land, and for their very survival. So today, we're going to dive into these other fronts of resistance. So let's start with a big question. What does it actually take to rebel? What pushes a person or a whole community to say, that's it, no more? When is enough, finally, truly enough? Just keep that question in the back of your mind, because we're about to explore three totally distinct but deeply connected struggles that were raging all across colonial India.
All right, so first up, let's talk about a battle that wasn't against a foreign ruler, but against a system that was centuries old and deeply embedded within society itself, the caste system. I mean, can you imagine that? Fighting for your country's freedom while being denied your own freedom, your own humanity, in the village where you were born. That was the reality for millions. For them, the struggle was a war on two fronts. It was this revolutionary battle being fought from the inside out, demanding not just political rights from the British, but basic social equality from their own countrymen. And that brings us to this incredibly powerful phrase from one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Now, he didn't just want to tinker with the caste system or reform it around the edges. No, he argued for its complete and total destruction. This was a radical, world-changing idea, and believe me, he had a very clear plan to make it happen. So how in the world do you take apart a system that's been in place for thousands of years? Well, Ambedkar laid out this clear four-part strategy. First up, education, the ultimate tool for empowerment. Second, mobility, breaking people free from the jobs their parents and grandparents were forced into. Third, and this was a huge one, directly attacking the religious texts that were used to justify caste in the first place. And finally, the masterstroke, organizing politically to capture real power and use the law to force change. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because this slide captures one of the great ideological debates of this century. You have Ambedkar and Gandhi both fighting untouchability, but their approaches couldn't have been more different. Ambedkar was all about a political solution. Seize power, forge a separate identity, use the law. He saw the system as fundamentally broken. Gandhi, on the other hand, went for a social and moral approach. He wanted to reform Hinduism from within, to change the hearts and minds of the upper castes. Two absolute giants with two profoundly different blueprints for justice. Okay, let's pivot now. We're moving to our second front of resistance. We're leaving the villages and the complexities of social hierarchy, and we're heading into the forests and hills of India. This is where indigenous communities were fighting a desperate battle, not just for land, but for their entire way of life. So picture this. Before the British showed up, tribal communities lived pretty much on their own terms. Their world was all about political autonomy, communal ownership, meaning the forest and its resources belonged to everyone, and this really deep spiritual connection to nature. It was a world with its own rules, its own gods, and its own delicate balance. And then came the daikus. You've got to understand this word. It was the name that tribal communities gave to all the outsiders who started pouring into their lands. The moneylenders, the landlords, the traders, and yeah, the British officials. To the tribals, these weren't just new neighbors. They were the living, breathing symbols of exploitation. And this slide just lays out the absolute collision of two worlds. The British shattered their isolation. They imposed these alien laws and introduced the idea of private property, which quickly led to tribal communities losing their ancestral lands. Then, new forest acts literally turned them into criminals for using the resources of their own homes. The result? A wildfire of resistance. Over 100 separate tribal uprisings across the country. And out of all of those, one of the most famous was the Ulgulan, which means the Great Tumult, led by a charismatic young man who would become an absolute legend. His name was Birsa Munda, and to his people, he was more than a leader. He was like a prophet, a messianic figure. His goal was brutally simple: drive out the Dikus, reclaim their land, their culture, their dignity. But his vision was epic. He wanted to end what he called the Kali Yuga, this age of darkness brought by the outsiders, and bring in a Satyug, a golden age of truth for his people. Okay, for our final story, we move from the forests to the fields. This is where millions of peasants, farmers, were being pushed right to the very brink by colonial economic policies. And this sparked a series of revolts that were, you might be surprised to hear, incredibly well organized and shockingly effective. So let's zoom in on the Indigo Revolt in Bengal. It's a fantastic case study. You had these European planters forcing peasants into these impossible contracts to grow indigo, that plant used for blue dye. The conditions were brutal, and the peasants made basically no money. Finally, in 1859, they just decided they had had enough. And just look at how smart their tactics were. This wasn't some random, chaotic riot. Oh no. Led by guys like the Biswas brothers, they launched a total cultivation strike. They physically fought back against the planters' hired thugs. They organized social boycotts against anyone who collaborated. They even pulled their money to fight legal battles in court. And crucially, they got the press and intellectuals on their side, who wrote articles and plays that exposed just how cruel the whole system was. And here's the kicker. It worked. It actually worked. The government was forced to step in, and faced with this incredibly unified resistance, the planters literally packed up their bags and fled Bengal. It was an absolutely stunning victory for a peasant movement.
And the Indigo Revolt wasn't a one-off thing. You can see a clear pattern emerging all over India. Look at Pabna. The problem was illegal rent hikes. Their solution? Organized legal resistance, which led to a new law protecting them. Over in the Deccan, the enemy was crippling debt. So what did they do? They targeted the moneylenders directly, burning the very bond papers that enslaved them. You see the theme, right? A very specific problem, a very targeted form of resistance, and often a concrete legal change as the result.
So, after all that, what do we take away from these three very different stories of struggle? What's the lasting impact of all this? Well, even though a lot of these movements were small, localized, and focused on really specific issues, they were absolutely not failures. What they did was create a culture of resistance. They taught people invaluable lessons about how to organize, how to mobilize. And slowly but surely, all these separate streams of anger and discontent started to flow together, feeding into the much larger river that would become the national freedom struggle.
And that really leaves us with one last thought. The fight for social dignity against systems that hold people down, the defense of cultural identity and land against powerful outsiders, the struggle for economic justice against exploitation. Do any of these battles sound familiar? They absolutely should, because the echoes of these early movements are all around us, in headlines and in communities today, reminding us that the fight for a truly just world is and always has been fought on many, many fronts.